Today we're going to continue with the treasures of Jewish mysticism, the jewels of the wisdom of Metatron, class number 5. So let's go ahead and start with some questions. The first question, can you please explain the relationship between Enoch and the Merkabah? What is the Merkabah? The Merkabah, it's a metaphor called a vehicle. And just like any vehicle, which starts at one place and it arrives at another place. In this case, Hanoch departed from this physical world and arrived in the metaphysical world. And that's his story. And that story is recorded in the book of Enoch and the book of the palaces, which is also the story of the Merkabah. That is how he moved along the path of ascension from this world to the other world. Another question. We have learned throughout these classes that each planet and star has its soul, and that soul is an angel. If this is the case, then does the earth also have a soul? And the answer is, of course. Of course, the earth has a soul, but it is a different soul than that of the stars and the other planets because it's passive. It's the only soul that receives. All of the other souls of all of the other planets and stars are givers, but planet Earth is a receiver. Just like there is an emission and a reception, with the Earth being a receptor. So therefore, if it has a soul, it has an angel. So there is an angel of the Earth, and it is a receiver of all of the influences that come from the cosmos. Another question, is it possible to assimilate the Big Bang Theory with the Tzimtzum? We are now finding out that it's being demonstrated that there wasn't a Big Bang. But the Tzimtzum is basically the dissimulation of the divine consciousness, so as to leave a space for a human consciousness. So therefore, the Tzimtzum is not an explosion, because if Hakadosh Baruch Hu did not contract himself, or if he didn't hide his consciousness, then he would encompass everything, and we wouldn't have a space to be. It's like two politicians who start talking. One starts talking and the other one doesn't let the other talk. So with one talking, the other one can't be. Or to say that with one talking, he doesn't let the other one exist, because the other one cannot express himself. Here it's the same, because if Hakadosh Baruch Hu doesn't retract himself, there wouldn't be anywhere for us to express ourselves. And that has nothing to do with the Big Bang. It is true that the divine presence in this world is born with the Tzimtzum, and physics tells us that the world was created with the Big Bang. And there is a lot to speak about the Big Bang, and quantum physics is working on that. Another question, what is the point of contact between the body and the soul, and how do we focus on that point? Does that mean that we think of Hashem at that point? And the answer is no. What is called the umbilical cord between the body and the soul, we call that the dot. That is the connection between the right brain and the left brain. The right brain is totally intuitive, and it is a macro antenna that receives its nourishment from the higher worlds. And the left brain tries to reason everything. The left brain is linked more with the physical body, and the right brain is linked more with the spiritual worlds. The connector between the two is the dot. That's why after we do a meditation, we ask those that are present that they express their meditation into words. The effort they make to verbalize something that's intuitive, it allows them to activate the connector between the body and the soul, the right brain and the left brain. Now, what is meant by how does one think of God? Everyone thinks about God according to the level of their evolution. That's why the Zohar talks about a story that we've told here before, and that is the story of a person who is on the shore and sees a small dark object at a distance on the horizon and says, "It looks like a fly." And as that small object gets closer, then he says, "Wait a minute, that's not a fly. It's a small rowboat." And then it gets even closer. And then the person says, "No, it's a sailboat." Then it comes closer. Then that person says, "No, it looks like a motorboat." And then it comes even closer. And then they say, "No, it's actually a transatlantic megaship, and it's 10 stories high." So depending on how close you get to the divine consciousness, that is the way you will see the divine consciousness of Hashem. And that is why we want to see the transatlantic megaship and not just a small fly. When we think about God, is it with the brain or should it be with the heart? The transatlantic megaship is not seen with the rational part of the brain. To see the transatlantic megaship, it's the image that you are already seeing with your extrasensory eyes. You're feeling it and you are connecting with it with the right part of the brain. Seeing it as a fly from a distance, seeing it as just a small dark spot at a distance, is still being very rational. Then if you are further from the divine consciousness, then it is more rational. The closer you are, the more you are understanding it or reasoning with your third eye. Next question. We have learned from listening to your classes that there are two ways to create events. One is with words and the other one with the drop of semen. However, experiments of quantum physics in the field of elementary particles, the scientists have been led to recognize that the mind is capable of creating realities, affirming that the observer has the capability of modifying the observed. Then how could we reconcile both theories? And the answer is very simple. It is how you observe your word, or say your speech, and how you observe your sexual relations. One is the support of the other, and therefore one gives an amplifying effect to your observation. For example, if you think of something, until you have expressed it, that thought is not amplified. We have learned that the word amplifies the thought, and the Hebrew language is a super amplifier, and the semen, when we meditate on it in a conjugal act that is pure, it becomes a super amplifier of thought, because you use all your creative energy and you use all that energy to associate it to your thought, and that is a springboard. It is a bridge that passes from one world to another. The word is a gateway, and so is the semen. Then how does the observer change what is observed? The observer amplifies his capacity to observe in his word and in his sexual relations. Another question. The question of whether making changes in the past could cause a paradox in a person's destiny. Considering that the rigorous events in people's lives correspond to a reparation, that is, when making changes in the past of a person or a family, how could the said changes impact the present and the future, or in the destiny of that person or family? This is a question that involves quantum physics and physics. I'm going to explain something very interesting. In order for me to be able to answer this question, I will have to explain what is called the grandfather's paradox. The grandfather's paradox is as follows, and I'm going to explain it as if it would apply to me. So say, for example, that I invent a time machine, and it allows me to go back in time. And I go to the past to find my grandmother, and I murder my grandmother before she meets my grandfather. Now you can ask, do I exist? I can tell you that I don't cease to exist because I just killed her. So therefore, how would I now come to exist since I came from my grandmother and my grandfather, and I have just killed my grandmother, and I have prevented them from knowing each other? Then I get back into my time machine, and I come back to the present time, and I continue living my life normally. How can I exist with that DNA that comes from my grandmother and my grandfather, who gave life to my father, who has in turn given life to me? Does my father cease to exist? No, my father continues to exist, and so do I. This is what you call the grandfather paradox. So you can ask, why do I continue to exist if I have killed my grandmother? And this is a paradox. The answer is, if I am capable of going to the past and I am able to change something from the past, then my state of consciousness has changed, and I am no longer me. I am another person, because he who is capable of traveling to the past has changed his level of consciousness. We know that a person is a level of consciousness. So therefore, he stops being himself. So therefore, the one who killed my grandmother was not me. It was somebody else. And in that interdimensional timeline, well, we pass to another level of understanding and into another timeline and dimension. My grandmother never died, and she found my grandfather, who both gave birth to my father and subsequently gave birth to me. And what happened in the past was not me. Everyone who is capable of traveling to the past changes in the level of consciousness. And this resolves the grandfather's paradox. So you can ask the question again, have we changed the past? We have changed the timelines, and we have entered into a dimension that is not our world that has changed, but it is another world that has changed. Why? Because he who has made it change has changed his state of consciousness and has slipped into another time and space, another timeline that is not ours, because there is one of me in this timeline, and in another timeline there is another one of me, and in another timeline there's another one of me, and in another timeline there's another one of me. And there is my father and my grandmother in one timeline, and in another timeline there is another father and grandfather. So therefore, the state of consciousness has changed from one timeline to another. That is to say, it has slipped into another timeline. Nothing has changed, but it has changed in another timeline. But in our world, everything stays the same. So therefore, in regards to quantum physics and in regards to time travel, there is lots to speak about. It is possible to change the past, but not in our timeline, but in another timeline, unless you do not change anything. If you don't change anything, you continue in your level of consciousness, and you go back to being you with your father and with your mother, etc. If you change something, then you slide into another timeline. When redemption happens in the coming of the Mashiach, all human beings will change the level of consciousness, and we will change in the timeline, and we will already be in a paradise where all the dramas of this world would have not existed. They would exist in a lower level of consciousness, with a lower vibration. But if the Mashiach arrives in our timeline, our world would change, and then everything that has happened in the past from Adam and Eve until now, all of the suffering, all of the inquisitions, the sex, the genocides, the racism, all of this would have not existed. But it would exist in another timeline because the level of vibration is much lower, because their Mashiach has not arrived yet. Another question. What is the spiritual root of someone that is autistic? And the answer is that it is a level of vibration much higher than that of a normal human being. Very much higher, and needless to say, the autistic soul is incapable of harming. They can be hurt by others, but they are not capable of hurting others. Their level of vibration is too high to cause any harm. They don't know discord. The root of their soul is very high, and their level of intelligence is according to the level of their soul, because they are in another plane of life. That is why I say that they are not capable of sinning. Let's go ahead and start today's class. Let's talk about Metatron. The impact that Metatron has had on all cultures of this world, and it is known of Metatron and of Enoch. Enoch, who was a personality before the deluge of the flood. Metatron's influence has impacted the creation of many religions who have been created by adopting that power to their idols. What happens is that the holiness, the Kedusha, of Metatron cannot be altered, it cannot be substituted, it cannot be adulterated, because its origin is embedded in Jewish mysticism. It's embodied in the Babylonian Talmud, and all this is authentic and genuine, and the copies will never come close to the original. All of the Book of Enoch, or the Book of the Palaces, is based on the genuineness of Metatron, and it's the jewel of Jewish mysticism. Many have tried to emulate it or resemble it, but nobody has ever come to that level. It is so much so that Metatron has the name of Yud-He-Vav-He, which is written in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 38b. It is also identified with Enoch in Genesis 5:24. And something that is very interesting is that Metatron is the celestial lawyer of Israel. Here we have two beautiful things. One is that we speak about Sandlephon, who is the archangel that collects the prayers of Israel and takes them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We know that Sandlephon is also an ascender, just like Metatron, and that person was Elianavi, the prophet Elijah. Sandlephon has the power to hide from God the sins of Israel. And above that, Metatron is the celestial lawyer of Israel. So therefore, when Metatron begins to start advocating, there is no blame because Sandlephon has hidden all of the blame. And this is generous love that is not known in this world. In this world, we know about gratuitous hate, but we don't know about gratuitous love. We have to be inspired by Sandlephon and Metatron to know what gratuitous love is. Metatron knows the secrets of Hashem, and he is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest of the celestial temple. Just like here on earth, there was a temple, and where the Kohanim were the priest, and the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. In the dimension of Metatron, there is a celestial temple that has never been destroyed, and its high priest is Metatron. In the decisions of heaven and in the decrees taken by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Metatron is the one who takes the role in the spiritual world of witness and custodian of the divine agreements with humanity, and the Sadiqim, which are the righteous. Those involved in the divine decrees are Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Metatron, the persons who are the object of the decree, but Metatron inscribes in heaven the merits of Israel. I want to say something very interesting about this concept. What was the first decree that was declared in the history of the story of Adam and Eve? What was the first decree? The first of all decrees, that is in the Garden of Eden, before all the history or all the story of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam said to Hakadosh Baruch Hu, "What a beautiful soul, the soul of King David. Why don't you give it life?" And Hakadosh Baruch Hu tells Adam, "There is no terrestrial life planned for King David." And Adam tells Hakadosh Baruch Hu, "From my 1,000 years that you have given me, I'm going to give King David 70 of my years." That is to say, Adam tells Hakadosh Baruch Hu that of the 1,000 years that you have given me, I'm going to live 930 years, and King David is going to live 70 years. And God says, "I agree." And this becomes a decree. And here Metatron writes down the first decree. From that decree to today, there has been thousands of decrees from Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And who has been the scribe, the recorder of all the decrees of all of the history of humanity? It has been Metatron. This means that Metatron is the Akashic memory of all of humanity. He who connects with Metatron has the wisdom of all of the story of humanity, all of the decrees of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, all of the discoveries that were discovered by the Tzaddikim of all generations, all of the prophets. He has all of the universal wisdom. The act of connecting with Metatron, because Metatron is the custodian of all these decrees. What is the last decree that Metatron holds? We have seen the first, but what is the last? There is one last decree, and between the first and the last, there are thousands of them. The last decree is the Berachah, the blessing that he has for the Mashiach. Metatron is the custodian of the blessing of the Mashiach, so that he can fulfill the redemption of humanity. This is the reason why Metatron is going to incarnate in the Mashiach. And in this incarnation, he will deliver that blessing. We are now starting to understand a lot of things. I have said in the past that Abraham Avinu and Isaac Avinu and Yaakov Avinu will incarnate into the Mashiach. And now, what I am saying that Metatron is going to incarnate into the Mashiach. Who are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They are the protectors of this world. The earth cannot disappear or cannot be destroyed. No one can alter it, no matter how much they try. Who is the one that will redeem this world? It is Metatron, incarnated into the Mashiach. And who is the one that gives universal wisdom of all that has happened in the history of humanity, from the beginning to the end? It is Metatron, who is the library of humanity of this earth throughout its history. He knows everything about the upper worlds and the lower worlds and everything that has happened. What we know and what we don't know. And Metatron writes down from heaven the merits of Israel. There came down 3 angels, 3 archangels, to be witnesses to the fact that Metatron is the recorder of all decrees. These angels were Gabriel, Michael, and Seraphiel. These 3 archangels, Gabriel, Michael, and Seraphiel, are the witnesses of what I am saying, that Metatron is the custodian of all the decrees that Hakadosh Baruch Hu has imposed on humanity. Now we are going to speak about something else. We're going to speak about how Enoch turns into Metatron. We are going to try to understand it. Adam in the Garden of Eden was a being of light. He didn't have a body. He was led outside of the Garden of Eden, and then he was dressed in a physical body. And this physical body, of course, was made out of skin and came down into this world. And we know that in this world, you cannot live without a physical body. The prophets of blessed memory promise the redemption. That is to say, to turn to the original state of Adam in paradise. And that is to say, for us to return back into being a being of light. To bring an end to death. What dies? The soul or the body? And of course, it's the body that dies. We're going to return to being a being of light and returning back to the Garden of Eden. Where does suffering and karma come from? They come from the astral influence. The astral influence only affects the body. If there is no body, there is no astral influence. There is no karma. There is no pain. There is no need to eat or sleep or suffer or illnesses. Then the redemption is the ability to ascend to a state of Adam before incorporating himself into a physical body. And there is a model that achieves this, and his name is Metatron. He is the first to auto-redeem himself. And then there was Elianavi, which is the prophet Elijah, and he redeemed himself. That is to say, he returned to the state that Adam was before eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That is to say, that the process of incarnating into a physical body. Metatron reversed the process of getting rid of that incarnation to be able to be a being of light. And now here comes a question. In this physical body, do we want to get rid of it? Because it also has its uses. Well, let's do the yo-yo effect. And do you know what the yo-yo effect is? It's like a seesaw. When we want to be made out of light, we will be made out of light. And when we want to have a physical body, we'll have a physical body. The Mashiach, is he a being of skin and bones? Metatron, where does he reincarnate himself? Into the Mashiach. Well, then Metatron will also be able to return to a physical body. So he will teach us how to go from a physical body to a being of light, and from a being of light into a physical body at will. We will all be bodies of Sadiqim, of righteous bodies. Our last body, or our last reincarnation, will be the panacea of all of our bodies. We will have learned to make our body the perfect body, because it is written, and we will make man in our image and likeness. But the Kabbalah asks, image and likeness of what? It is of the image of the perfect body that God has designed. So therefore, that is what you call the superior self. The superior self is like us. So it's me, but in a perfect state. But I am a crude image of what God thought I had to be. A much kinder face, a much brighter and much higher and much more perfect body, and everything more perfect. Then when we go back to our body, it will be like the body that is the image of our higher self. Enoch fathered Methuselah at the age of 65 and lived 365 years. I want you to know that in that era, people lived up to 900 years old. And in that era, which was before the deluge, before the flood, Enoch fathered more sons and more daughters, and then God took him. This is in the Talmud in Midrash Rabbah of Bereshit 25:1. Here in the Book of the Palaces, it says something very interesting. It says that sometimes a righteous person who has come to a very high level, a very high evolution, could actually fall. due to circumstances of life and sin. So what does God do? Before he sins, he will take him away. That is why Enoch, God took him away very young at 365 years old, instead of taking him at 900 years old, because he had already reached a certain level of ascension that God said, I don't want to take a chance that he could sin between the 365 years and the 900 years that a human being lived at that time. God took Enoch out of this world and turned him into Metatron so that he could not give him the option to fall, because he had already elevated a lot. The Book of the Palaces also says something more extraordinary. It says that Metatron did not know death because he was an ascended being. His body was transformed into the same texture as the soul, that is to say, into pure energy. But Enoch had already visited the Garden of Eden for 300 years. This means that if Enoch lived 365 years, he ascended for 65 years, and from 65 years to 365 years, he was already coming and going into the Garden of Eden. That is, he was capable of disintegrating and reintegrating for 300 years, until God completely disintegrated him, and he disintegrated him into the being of light. This is what we call an angelmorphosis. That is, to transform yourself into an angel. And Hakadosh Baruch Hu restored in Enoch the condition of the primordial Adam. That is to say, he gave him again the situation that Adam had been before he came down to this earth. That is to say, to make him a being of light. As a reward, he identified him as the chief of all of the celestial beings. And here we get another etymology of Metatron. It says that Metatron comes from the Greek root of metete, which means to transfer. And the last particle of metete is ron, Metatron, or Metatron. Ron is the particle of the angels, as for example, Adiriaron and Sadnegaron. Well, then Metatron means that he was transferred to the state of angel, because Ron is the particle of very high angels, and Metete is to transform, that is to say that Metatron was transformed into a state of angel. Sometimes Metatron is called Na'ar, which means young, a young man, because he was heir to the upper part of the soul of Adam. The soul of Adam has the form of a physical body. The highest part is the mental part, and there's the parts of the different upper limbs, and then the sexual parts and the parts of the lower limbs. Metatron, Nar, is called a young man because he was the heir to the mental part of Adam, the highest, most elevated part of Adam. This is a metaphor for spiritual ascension. This part of the soul of Metatron, son of Yaret, because the father of Enoch was called Yaret, and his son was Methusalem, and he was called the Prince of the World. That is because he comes from Absolute and governs all of the worlds. And now, in finishing up, I want to say that Enoch has the numerology equal to 84, which is the same as the word Edi, which means my witness, which has also the value of 84. That is to say that Enoch acted as God's witness. We will stop here and continue in class number 6. Thank you.